Tucked away in the attic of the home where I grew up, on a crudely fashioned and unfinished spruce bookcase, was a collection of the works of Lucy Maud Montgomery, which my mother had devoured as an adolescent. The cloth-covered volumes, which I've always assumed were gifts from her father, stood near the containers of fabrics and yarn that Mum used to create innumerable Afghans and quilts over the years. Looking back, it seems strange to me that Mum didn't keep the books in a more prominent place, where they would have been more easily accessible instead of hidden from view. Perhaps it's that attics are a good place for mischief, but a part of me worries that she felt her Montgomery collection wasn't worthy of a place out in the open alongside my father's more serious tomes. I hope not. It's as though she sequestered her adolescence in that corner of the attic. She wouldn't have been the first person to ever store her past in an attic. What I do know for certain is that Mum discarded most of the books she read over the years. She was an avid reader, but she held on to the works of Lucy Maud Montgomery to the very end, when they were passed on to an adult granddaughter. Anne mattered to her. For those of you who are unfamiliar with it, Anne of Green Gables is the story of an orphan girl from Nova Scotia, Anne Shirley, who at the age of 11 is taken in by Matthew and Marilla Cuthbert in the fictional community of Avonlea on Prince Edward Island. They were seeking a boy to help an aging Matthew with chores around the farm. So the first challenge to be overcome is what to do when a red-haired, spirited, and chattering girl arrives instead of a boy. Matthew and Marissa are brother and sister. And Marilla's initial instinct is to send Anne back to the orphanage from which she came. But Matthew, a shy and quiet man, was charmed by the girl on their ride home from the train depot. Marilla heads off to a neighbor's home to explain that there has been a terrible mistake and that she and her brother hadn't received the boy they ordered. Another woman with a brood of children in need of a new girl happened by, but she had a reputation for exploiting her domestic help. So Marilla decided to keep Anne, at least long enough to keep her out of the clutches of this other woman. The story unfolds from there, with the red-headed witch, as Anne is once called, stumbling from one humorous vignette to the next. In the process, the affection between Anne and her new guardians deepens, and Marilla is revealed to have a wry sense of humor, while Matthew's gentleness and understanding redeems the mistakes along the way. The three transform each other's lives, always for the better, despite the pain and difficulty that's sometimes involved. Marilla and Anne are a stubborn match for one another. While countless lives have been touched by these tales, I've long suspected that my mother's love for Anne of Green Gables was due in part to the ways in which Matthew and Marilla may have reminded her of her own parents. Mum was neither an orphan nor a red-headed witch, and her foibles were tame compared to Anne's, but I think the stories helped her to better understand her parents, her whimsical and affectionate father, and her stern mother, who had little time for playfulness. In a way, Mum grew up at Green Gables, but on Brooklyn Street in St. James. I'm sure countless adolescents over the generations have resonated with Anne of Green Gables, much as my mother did. When Mom was 71, I took her to visit Green Gables, just the two of us. My parents had planned to visit Nova Scotia when Dad retired, but he didn't live to see the day. When the Canadian Unitarian Council held its annual convention in Halifax, I invited Mom to join me. And knowing her love of Anne and her creator, I took her to the real Avonlea, Cavendish, Prince Edward Island, where we visited Green Gables and a few other spots, including the final resting place of Lucy Maud Montgomery and her husband, the Reverend Ewan MacDonald. It was the only time Mom visited this place that had occupied such a large piece of real estate in her childhood imagination. When we arrived there, I witnessed my mother become 12 or 14 years old all over again. It was magical, magical. She recalled the characters and passages from the books as though she had just read them. And she spoke of their meaning to her as a child and their enduring meaning in adulthood. I learned that I was named for Matthew, my middle name. So I'm glad it was me who took her there. The visit allowed me to see a side of my mother that I might have missed otherwise, save for this one glorious day in Cavendish. I wish we had lingered longer, much longer. If we were to make that trip today, we'd spend a whole vacation there. I've long described November as my month of sorrows, but last month I immersed myself in the writings of Lucy Maud Montgomery, and I enjoyed a November unlike any I've known since I was a teenager myself. I had seen the television series years ago, but I had never read anything more than the excerpts from any of Montgomery's books, along with snippets that appear in books of quotations. I was enraptured, just as Matthew had been charmed by Anne Shirley on their first journey together by horse and buggy, when a bend in the road revealed to Anne the beauty of Avonlea. Here I am, nearing retirement, and only now discovering the full meaning and the aspirations behind my own middle name. It took the 150th anniversary of Lucy Maud Montgomery's birth, which was marked on November 30th, to lead me to read Anne of Green Gables, which, since it was released in June of 1908, has never been out of print. In fact, it had to be reprinted 10 times during the first year. It now has been translated into at least 36 languages, as well as Braille. During her lifetime, L.M. Montgomery published a total of 20 novels, 530 short stories, at least 500 poems and 30 essays, as well as an autobiographical sketch in 6 parts for a popular Toronto magazine. She is undoubtedly the most famous Prince Edward Islander in history and one of the most celebrated Canadian authors of all time. Historical curiosity led me to a world of wonder that I never imagined, and now I'm hooked. Having read the first volume, I proceeded to read 2 of the sequels, Anne of Avonlea and Anne of the Island, as well as Montgomery's collection of autobiographical essays, The Alpine Path. And now I've moved on to Rainbow Valley, and I have no intention of stopping there. I intend to complete the series. I wish I had thought to claim the books when they were being distributed after my mother's death. Her Montgomery stories of Avonlea remind me of Stephen Leacock's tales about Mariposa. There is a gentle humor that flows through all of them, a clever wit, even when she deals with the most serious topics. And her style has been arguably emulated by more recent humorists like Garrison Keillor and Stuart McLean. I strongly identified with Anne growing up, says my colleague and friend Katie Cobb, who, like Anne, grew up with braided red hair, bright red hair. I did a book report on one of the Anne books in the 9th grade, she recalls, which concerned my English teacher, who felt that I should be reading more challenging literature. She called my mother, who told her she wasn't concerned, since I had read David Copperfield in the 6th grade and enjoyed it thoroughly. Get over it, she seemed to be suggesting. Now retired, Katie says she's rereading her favorite books and expects to get to Anne pretty soon. I wonder if Katie's English teacher from so many years ago would have felt the same about Anne of Green Gables if its author had been one of the weighty male humorists of the era. The decision to publish as L.M. Montgomery instead of Lucy Maud was a conscious one. She had concluded that her writing would be taken more seriously if her gender was not revealed up front. And she was almost certainly correct. But nobody assumed, least of all her, that her first book would be wildly popular and that she would become a household name around the world, and everyone would soon know the identity of the woman behind the initials. It's unfortunate that English-speaking readers have typically regarded Montgomery's work not only as adolescent literature, but specifically adolescent literature for girls. This does a great disservice to the work. When Anne of Green Gables was translated into the Scandinavian tongues, by contrast, it was considered appropriate reading for girls and boys, women and men, and it proved to be a popular confirmation gift. The most popular confirmation gift for 2 decades, in fact. And beyond the thought that it's a work for adolescents only, the series actually addresses transitions, whether one is 16 or 64. The series speaks to the vicissitudes of life, our development as individuals throughout the lifespan. Much of so-called adolescent literature does this. And when I look at the frightful behavior of so many adults in our society, I can't help but think that the whole population would benefit from a generous dose of adolescent literature so that we might, for once, grow up. A bend in the road is a recurring motif in Lucy Maud Montgomery's stories about Anne. Oh, there's another bend in the road at their end, she writes in Anne of the Island. I've no idea what may be around it. I don't want to have. It's nicer not to know. And then she says, when I left Queens, my future seemed to stretch out before me like a straight road. I thought I could see along it for many a milestone. Now there is a bend in it. I don't know what lies around the bend, but I'm going to believe that the best does. Our lives are full of such bends in the road. In fact, it's the one thing we can count on through life, that the road will always bend and lead us in directions that we never imagined we would travel. That is the very basic nature of human life. And it is revealed in Anne of Green Gables and its sequels not as a problem, but as the very glory of human existence. A minister could build an entire career preaching only themes and illustrations drawn from the writing of Lucy Maud Montgomery. It's all there. Life and death, truth and justice, goodness and evil, error and forgiveness, love and loss. That should come as no surprise, since Montgomery was a lifelong Presbyterian, and not long after Anne of Green Gables skyrocketed to success, she married Ewan MacDonald, a Presbyterian minister. Sadly for him and his parish, he reputedly couldn't be bothered to read her work. So he was likely unaware of the heathenish tones to be found in it. Given that he himself had a reputation as something less than a compelling preacher, perhaps we catch a glimpse of him in the character of old Reverend Mr. Bentley. His pulpit career might have benefited from a greater familiarity with literature, especially his own wife's stories. I particularly love one passage from the original Green Gables book in which Anne recounts her mistakes. What a glorious service this has been for honoring Montgomery and this error-prone heroine that she writes about. At one point, Anne lists the mistakes. The affair with the amethyst brooch, which cured her of meddling with things that didn't belong to her. The haunted wood mistake that cured her of letting her imagination run away with her. The liniment cake, which cured her of carelessness in cooking, or perhaps more accurately, led her not to assume that Marilla's labels were to be trusted. She goes on, and at this point she says, "Today's mistake cures me of being too romantic." Well, I'm a romantic. And my mother was a romantic. And my grandfather was a romantic. And I deny that it needs to be cured. Anne, of course, knew this. Montgomery certainly did. So she's never fully cured of it. But in response to her suggestion here, Marilla says skeptically, "Well, I sure hope so." But not Matthew. He had been sitting there mutely in the corner, and he laid his hand on Anne's shoulder when Marilla had gone out. "Don't give up all your romance, Anne," he whispered shyly. "A little of it is a good thing. Not too much, of course. But keep a little of it, Anne. Keep a little of it." In Anne of Avonlea, Montgomery has Anne say, "I hope they won't call Mr. Baxter from East Grafton here," referring to the congregation waiting for a new minister, something you may be experienced with. "He wants the call, but he does preach such gloomy sermons," she said. "Mr. Bell says that he's a minister of the old school. But Mrs. Lynde says there's nothing whatever the matter with him but indigestion. His wife isn't a very good cook, it seems, and Mrs. Lynde says that when a man has to eat sour bread 2 weeks out of 3, his theology is bound to get a kink in it somewhere." Now, I should probably pause here to say that nobody should judge Cindy's cooking nor anything else about her other than her patience and forbearance on the quality of my sermons. I should also acknowledge that I do most of the cooking, so if anyone is going to suffer indigestion, it will be her. I am solely responsible for their contents of my sermons and their dullness, sourness, or kinks, whatever they may be. Montgomery's work is noteworthy for its religious liberality and her naturalistic themes. It is heathenish in ways that we would consider very favorable. It's interesting to me that Montgomery wrote extensively about twilight and moonlight, but rarely about daylight and sunrise. Oh, there were plenty of bright and sunny days in Avonlea, but the light came to her in twilight and in candlelight, when most of us would notice only the darkness. And this very much reflects Montgomery's own life. When she invokes the candle or the moon or the twilight, we can be sure that she is about to make an important observation or reflect deeply on the events of the day. She also showed a distinctly contemporary take on religious rituals. Why must people kneel down to pray, Anne asks. If I really wanted to pray, I'll tell you what I'd do. I'd go out into a great big field all alone, or into the deep, deep woods. And I'd look up into the sky, up, 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 into that lovely blue sky that looks as if there is no end to its blueness. And then I'd just feel a prayer. For those long ago whose Christianity was very conventional, this kind of writing from Maud Montgomery, as she preferred to be called, was liberating. It opened to them a world and possibilities that they might not otherwise dream of while attending church or listening to their parents or their grandparents. Maud Montgomery's tales about Anne of Green Gables opened a whole different world up to the young girls and the young boys who read them. It showed another way of being religious in the world, a different way of understanding creation and glorifying its natural beauty. We would all do well to just feel a prayer rather than trying to figure out how to say one. It is never quite safe to think we have done with life, Montgomery wrote in Rainbow Valley. When we imagine we have finished our story, fate has a trick of turning the page and showing us yet another chapter. And so it is that at 64, we may discover a book we should have read when we were 16. So it is that people like Maud Montgomery changed the lives of countless individuals. Or perhaps she just leads us to another bend in the road. Please join in our closing hymn, number 108, My Life Flows On in Endless Song.